Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are. I'm Jim Stock, co-editor of Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. On behalf of my co-editor, Jan Eberly, the Brookings Economics Program, and the Brookings Institution, welcome to our Spring 2021 conference. We have 4 regular papers and 2 panels, one panel on the COVID crisis, and a second on intellectual contributions by Brookings Papers over the last 50 years. Last March was our 50th anniversary, but for obvious reasons, we pivoted at that point. But we're going to return to the theme of Brookings' 50th anniversary this afternoon, and we'll say a little bit more about that before it begins. Let me go over some mechanics. The session timetables, authors have 15 minutes, discussants have 12 minutes, and then the rest is open discussion. The panels have 15 minutes per panelist, and then the rest is open discussion. It is, as the authors and presenters know, as everyone knows, at this point, it's kind of tough to stay on schedule to intervene in Zoom, so please stay on schedule. At lunch, we're going to have 3 breakouts for the participants. So after a 10-minute break, we'll have 3 different sessions. You should have gotten some information from Anna Dawson yesterday at 11 o'clock with some links, and she'll send the links again at 1 o'clock this afternoon. So grab some food and then eat and join, and hopefully each session will be on a topic from the morning. Zoom protocol. So important note. So just like we were in June and September, this is being webcast live, so everything is on the record. If you're a participant, you can ask questions during the conference, and Jan and I will call on you. The best way to do that is to use your raise the hand feature, and then we will unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question. If you don't want to do it that way, you can type in a question into Q&A. You can also use the chat function. We'll be monitoring that. If none of that works, you can email events@brookings.edu, and hopefully that will come through. So that's order of preference. If you have any technical issues, email Anna Dawson at Brookings. And without any further ado, let's go to the first session. So the first session, the paper is by Jamie Lenny, Brian Lutz, Finn Schula, Louise Shaner, and Brian Lutz is going to be the presenter.
All right, hopefully everybody can see the slides. If not, somebody should let me know. Okay, I want to take that.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, thank you, Jim. Okay. I want to take the opportunity at the outset to say a major thank you to Lorena Barcena and R.A. Brookings, who has been absolutely essential to this project. Okay, I need to start with the disclaimers that the opinions you hear today are those of the authors and not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve nor of the Bank of England. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the fiscal sustainability of state and local government pension plans today. And we're going to be asking, are these pensions fiscally sustainable under current benefit and funding levels? And if not, what could be done to render them sustainable? To give you a preview of what we're going to find, in aggregate, we find that these pensions are not currently sustainable under low or moderate asset returns, but that they can be stabilized in most of our scenarios with what we'll term moderate fiscal adjustments. We find only modest returns to be getting the stabilization process today versus, say, waiting 10 years in the future. But there's tons of heterogeneity in this space, and some plans are far from stable. In terms of background, in recent years, there's been really significant concern expressed over the size of unfunded state and local pension liabilities. Our discussant today, Josh Rao, has estimated these liabilities are as large as $4 trillion. And this is very similar to the now official estimates put out by the BPEA, the Fed, and others. You know, these estimates imply a funding ratio of only 50%, meaning the assets on hand will only cover half of the benefits accrued to date. This lack of full pre-funding has generated really widespread sustainability concerns for the pensions. This has come in a sort of a nonstop flow from academics, the press, rating agencies, and policymakers. But stepping back from the standard narrative, it is useful to realize that pre-funding is not required for fiscal sustainability. In fact, in the extreme, even a fully unfunded pay-as-you-go pension can be sustainable. A fact that's been well understood since at least the work of Paul Samuelson in the 50s. A pay-go plan will be sustainable if the internal rate of return paid to retirees does not exceed the growth rate of the wage base. In this case, you can simply pay benefits to current retirees out of the contributions going in for current workers and maintain stability. Another way to see this basic point is to note that unfunded pension liabilities are simply a form of implicit public debt. And as has been widely discussed in recent years in the macro space, of course, public debt does not have fiscal costs in all circumstances. In particular, in low interest rate environments, you may be able to roll over the debt and maintain it as a share of the economy without any need for tax or expenditure adjustments. A fairly straightforward corollary to this is that the failure to fully pre-fund pensions does not necessarily imply the need for future fiscal adjustments. You may simply be able to roll over the unfunded liabilities as a share of your economy. But I do want to be excuse me, very clear here that, caution is required. Pension debt may be sustainable in principle, but it need not be so in practice. And in fact, again, our findings suggest that under low or moderate asset returns, they're not currently stable. Okay, so most analysis of state and local pension plans to date has focused very heavily on a full pre-funding benchmark. In contrast, we're going to focus on pension sustainability of only partially pre-funded plans. And the analysis of partially pre-funded plans is very consistent with the historical record, as all the official sources now show that state and local pensions have never even approached full funding at any point in their history in aggregate. So we're taking these plans very much as they are and as how they have always operated. Okay, in terms of methodology, analyzing fiscal sustainability requires having projections of the full future flow of promised benefit payments to retirees. Very unfortunately, these cash flows are typically not available. We're going to respond to this by reverse engineering the cash flows. We're using a method pioneered by Novi, Marks, and Rao, our discussant Josh today. These authors deserve a lot of credit for innovating this method because it enables several types of analysis that are just infeasible without it. To do this, we're going to collect data by hand from the actuarial reports and financial statements of the plan on things like plan membership, actuarial assumptions such as mortality assumptions, and plan benefit parameters, things like cost of living adjustment. We then construct statistical machinery to age our workers and retirees each year and calculate benefits each year. And then finally, we add in new workers based on demographic assumptions. We're doing this for a sample of 40 plans. This relatively small sample size reflects the extremely labor-intensive nature of the methodology and the real care that we put into modeling each plan to ensure that we have the contour of benefits correct, because as you'll see, that's crucial to our results. However, our sample is observationally essentially identical to the universe of state and local pensions. Okay, so here we have our first result. We plot total aggregate benefit payments going to retirees as a share of the economy in the US by year. The first thing to note here is benefits rise over the next decade and then flatten out, but the rise is quite muted, only about 5% when denominated as a share of the economy. These benefits then decline really substantially. This is quite important because it indicates that plans have fiscal relief in train and carries the implication that there's the ability to smooth through this period of peak outlays. It's also a very surprising finding. It certainly surprised us tremendously when we first got it. Because of the aging of the population, we project that the ratio of beneficiaries of these plans to their workforces are set to rise sharply over the next 2 decades. All else equal, this would tend to push up benefit payments as a share of the economy. So we've put great care into trying to model why this is the case. And it turns out there's 2 key reasons. The first is that in recent years, cost of living adjustments have very systematically been set below expected rates of inflation. And this causes for any given retiree the value of their real benefits to decline over their years of their retirement. The second factor is that although the plans are typically legally inhibited from reducing the benefits of current workers, they have full latitude to do that for workers not yet hired. And systematically, almost all the plans in our sample have enacted fairly large downward adjustments to the generosity of the plan for new hires. You can see the effect of these 2 factors on benefit outflows by comparing the gray line, which is our baseline estimates, to the blue line, which is a counterfactual where we set COLAs equal to inflation and we simply flip off all the new hire reforms in our sample. And you can see that the effects are dramatic. About 2 decades out, there's a 15% difference between the baseline and the counterfactual. And then further out, there's a full 30% difference. The fact that these factors are pushing down benefits so significantly is really a first order fact in assessing the fiscal sustainability of these plans. And we believe that we're the first to systematically document this for the nation. This is an outcome of the fact that we very carefully modeled all the different benefit tiers for new and old, old hires. Okay, so moving on to the sustainability analysis, we're going to assume here that plans maintain current contributions and benefit. We're going to discount the stream of future benefit payments at a risk-free rate. Although, as we discussed in the paper, the choice of discount rate has very little influence on our estimate of how much contributions need to change to stabilize. We're going to consider 4 deterministic real rates of return. The first is a risk-free rate that's 0%, market-based, based on current TIPS yield. That was about a month ago, though they haven't changed tremendously. We do view this as conservative. The market-based risk-free return measures may overstate the cost of governments bearing risk due to their ability to spread risk both contemporaneously and particularly intergenerationally. Now, there's a large literature on how to think about risk and government budgeting going back to the 60s. Debbie Lucas, our discussant today, has been a key contributor to that, and I know she's going to have some things to say. So we're very interested to hear about that because this is an area we've wrestled with. So we're also, because of this, we're also going to present some other rates of return, just a 5% expected rate of return. This is simply the risk-free rate with a 5% equity premium, which is about the historical equity premium. We're going to do a middle ground 2.5% real return. And we're also going to use the CBO's risk-free rate projection, which remains low for many years, but then gradually rises more towards its historical average. Okay, so here we plot total assets for state and local pensions as a share of GDP. The black line shows what happens to these assets under current benefit and contribution parameters, and the black line is a 0% rate of return. You see the assets are drawn down and exhausted in about 30 years. The red line shows what happens under a 2.5% rate of return. Again, they draw down more slowly, but are exhausted in about 45 years. With assets falling continuously, debt is rising indefinitely. The plans are clearly not sustainable. They are, though, more than sustainable at the 5% expected rate of return as assets grow without bound. Okay, so under the low and moderate returns, what could be done to stabilize these plans? We're going to run 2 exercises. The first is a long run exercise, which calculates the one-time change to contribution levels made in perpetuity that would result in the pension debt or unfunded liabilities as a share of GDP to be constant in the long run in our steady state, but without regard to the level of that debt. We also do a medium-term 30-year exercise where we calculate the change, which if maintained for 30 years, would result in the debt to GDP ratio exactly matching today's in 30 years time. I want to be, intuitively, this exercise is the dig the hole no deeper over the next 30 years idea. I want to be clear that all stabilization exercises involve stabilizing unfunded liabilities and also honoring all benefit payments. I also do want to be clear, because it can be obscure given we don't have a lot of time today, that although it never occurs in aggregate, there are some instances of particular plans running into negative asset positions. What this entails is that these plans would take out marketable debts when their assets are exhausted, use the proceeds to pay benefits over the period in which the benefits as a share of the economy are receding, and then in steady state they make current benefit payments and service the debt out of their contributions going in each year. But this is not the typical outcome by far, but I do want to be clear about that. Okay, here's our first result. We see for stabilization, we see that at a 2.5% rate of return, if you start today, you need to increase your contributions by 8% of payroll in order to stabilize your debt in the long run. To put this into context, over the last 10 years, pension plans have increased their contributions as a percent of payroll by 10%. So if they do a bit less than what they've done over the last 10 years over and again, they would be able to stabilize their debt at the 2.5% rate of return. This only goes up to 10% of payroll if they wait 30 years, although it does come at the expense of stabilizing at a higher level of pension debt. Now, of course, if we go to the risk-free rates of return, the contribution increases become larger. These are certainly not small and would entail some, moderate to more than that fiscal strain. It's about 15% of payroll, but it certainly seems achievable in the context of having done 10% in the last 10 years. An interesting aspect here is that the required contribution actually declines if you wait. This may seem counterintuitive, but it's really the relatively straightforward result of the fact that purely from the standpoint of debt stabilization, when GDP growth is above the rate of asset returns, assets impose a pure cost on you. They're never available to pay benefits, and you have to put in additional money each and every year simply to maintain the assets as a share of the economy and therefore keep your debt stable. And so by waiting, you draw down your assets and stabilize them at a lower level, which is actually less costly. Okay, so I'll now turn to the medium run exercise here. We're getting back in 30 years to where we are today in terms of debt to GDP. At a 2.5% rate of return, it's a 7% increase. The cost of delay in this case is larger. It goes up to 17%. There's a larger than compared to the long run exercise. That is because in this instance, you're waiting 30 years, accruing more debt, but you then have to pay that debt down over the subsequent 30 years, and that becomes more costly than the long run exercise. Okay, a point I want to make on this slide is that regardless of your preferred rate of return, in all cases, the increase in contributions required to stabilize debt is much lower, radically lower than that what would be required to move to full funding in 30 years. So the table on the right here shows the contribution increases required to reach full funding in 30 years, which has been a heavy focus of the past literature. And we see here that at 2.5% today, you have to increase about 35%. But if you only want to stabilize your debt over 30 years, it's a 7% increase, 1/5 as large. This table very clearly shows the different tenor of our results relative to a lot of the past work. Okay, the last result I will show you, because I'm almost out of time, is the very important heterogeneity. On the vertical axis, we have our calculation of the required contribution change at 0% rate of return to stabilize in 30 years. And on the horizontal axis, we have the traditional funding ratio. I'd like you to take two things away from this graph. The first is that there's tremendous heterogeneity in terms of the required contribution. There are some plans that have to make horrifically large contributions, and there are a lot of plans that actually can cut. The second thing I want to emphasize is that the identity, the place where the particular plans fall may really surprise you. For instance, the two state Illinois plans here, which are among the most poorly funded in the nation, actually can cut contributions and stabilize, even at a 0% rate of return. And this is the result of the fact that these plans have made absolutely massive contribution increases in recent years and radically reduced the value of the benefits to new workers, which our forward-looking measures give them a lot of credit for. Okay, I am out of time. So my last point will just be to acknowledge we have lots of limitations in this paper, of course. One that is clear is that we use a deterministic framework which ignores risk, particularly around asset returns. We'd like to address this in a stochastic framework in future work. It's also the case that it's very difficult to think about pension funding in isolation from the broader state and local budgets and objectives. Our paper suffers from this, as does most other papers in this space, and we'd like to address that in the future. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Byron. Our first discussant is Debbie Lucas.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I want to just one second. Okay, I want to start by applauding the authors for their contribution to our understanding of what future benefit payments associated with S&L pension liabilities will look like, and for emphasizing the importance of those projections for evaluating the sustainability of a public pension plan. I guess it's said that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So I'll note that we have a project underway at the Golub Center to do a similar exercise for what we hope will be a much larger universe of plans. We're just getting started on that, but I can attest to how much work it is to create each new data point. I also want to emphasize a few points where there's fundamental agreement. The first is that reasonable projections for assets and liabilities suggest that absent a major meltdown in asset prices, there is unlikely to be a serious crisis caused by S&L pension plans being unable to meet their liabilities, at least not the sort of crisis that will have major repercussions for the aggregate economy. To elaborate a little, even if some plans run out of funds much sooner than suggested by the analysis in this paper, and I believe that some will, those exhaustion dates should be staggered over time, again, absent a very major market meltdown. Hence, I agree it's wrong to view the situation as an impending crisis. I also want to concur with the lack of any imperative to quickly or fully close pension funding gaps, although for reasons that are quite different than the ones suggested in this paper. I've written about this in the past and excerpted from that work in the appendix to these slides, but I won't spend time on that today. But in any case, the authors go much further. They argue for the provocative position that not only is there not a looming crisis, but really there's no reason to worry. In fact, they suggest it might well be desirable to divert funds from covering funding shortfalls, and that such policy is likely to be sustainable. Along the way, they also question the need for risk-adjusted discounting in public finance, which has been my life's work. But in the interest of time, I'll put that in my written comments and not talk about that today. What I want to focus on is the fact that this conclusion about this high degree of sustainability comes from a trip down the rabbit hole of R-G identity accounting. So my discussion is mainly about what this sort of analysis is for, the reasons this sort of analysis is highly misleading in general, and in particular in the context of public pension funds and the conditions that would be necessary to make them sustainable. Okay, so let me start by quickly summarizing my main points, because I might not have time to really elaborate on all of them. So just to start with the values of R considered here in the analysis, I don't think the choices are the best ones, even if you are going to accept a risk-free paradigm. I think basic theory, basic optimization theory implies that in general, certainly in any steady state analysis, R is greater than G. So there's the theoretical point, but also I think if you look at what's going on in financial markets today, you would come to a different conclusion about the likely level of future R. Perhaps more fundamentally, defining sustainability as stability is unsatisfactory for both conceptual and practical reasons that I want to go over. So going a little bit back to the return on assets, it's likely to be higher, but more importantly, more volatile, much more volatile than what's assumed here. So I want to suggest that under a more reasonable definition of sustainability that takes into account the possibility of running out of funds along the path that you're on, rather than under some kind of a steady state assumption, funding levels matter a lot, and a larger number of plans would be classified as unsustainable. So the first issue is, if you're going to do a steady state analysis, what's the right risk-free rate that you might choose? Clearly, it's possible, and many believe likely, that interest rates are going to rise significantly, and that generally they can be expected to exceed GDP growth. So let me start out with the support for that from first principles. I always enjoy doing this math, and I'm going to not walk you through all of it, but just make the main point. So if you just looking at this slide, if you just write down the simplest intertemporal utility maximization problem where people are smoothing their consumption between today and tomorrow, it becomes clear that the way that RNG actually interact is through preferences, and taking that into account, in fact, you get, if you assume that utility takes a log form, you get the result very quickly, that as long as the rate of time preference is positive, the interest rate is going to exceed the growth rate. I think the best way to think about that is if you think of the growth rate as coming out of something like productivity growth, the interest rate is coming out of market clearing. So the market is responding in terms of its savings and investing decisions, and the R is clearing that market. And if there's a positive rate of time preference, you wind up with an R which is greater than G by approximately the rate of time preference. While I'm on the theoretical side, I just want to point out that there's an old paper by Kip Viscusi that noted some of the properties that are emphasized in this paper about the kind of weird things that happen when you assume a zero interest rate. He noted, for instance, that there's no advantage to acting now instead of later. He actually labeled this as a paradox, not as something you might want to use to analyze the world. And he noted that it could lead to conclusions we actually don't like, such as that we might be indifferent to waiting indefinitely to take any action to abate climate change. Okay. So in any case, let's go on to what the market has to say about all of this. I have two graphs here. One is simply a picture of the current severely upward sloping yield curve there on the right. And if you look at the implied forward rates on that yield curve, the nominal implied forward rate, say between 2026 and 2051, is 4.4%, much higher than most of the rates assumed in the analysis. It's also interesting to look at the implied volatility data and to see that actually opinion has changed on the likelihood that we will wind up in this higher inflation regime, which will lead to higher interest rates. Okay. Okay, so what I would just say about that in conclusion is, like other R minus G analyses that suggest governments can spend freely without adverse consequences, the authors are focusing on current levels of RNG that in this moment in time favor that optimistic conclusion. However, for long-term or steady state analysis, best practice would suggest putting more weight on his historical experience or more normal configurations of RNG, as well as considering forward-looking indicators from market rates. But now let me turn to the fundamental question of sustainability. The paper focuses on the stability of the steady state ratio of debt to GDP, but I think it's reasonable, and most economists would agree, that size also matters for debt to GDP sustainability. Quite simply, when debt to GDP is at 100%, it's much more sustainable than if it's at 200% or 500%. This is just one of my favorite pictures from the cover of CBO's long-term budget outlook. And at the federal level, we don't seem to be converging to any steady state. But in any case, it's also important to note that if you do have these underfunded state and local plans and you add that underfunding or that level of debt to GDP on top of what's going on at the federal level, it looks a bit scarier, a lot scarier than what they have in the paper. Okay, so what does constitute stability? I think there's also more fundamental considerations that arise from political and institutional constraints. So an alternative definition that I'd prefer is that a fund is sustainable if it can meet its contractual obligations with a high probability. I think the analogy is to the Social Security system, where whatever the truth is about the future of the economy and the sustainability of benefits, kind of in theory, the exhaustion of the trust fund will trigger a crisis because budget authority will run out to pay full benefits. And so in the same way for state and local plans, if their assets go to zero, that is a crisis, at least a local crisis. So the steady state or the very long run is largely irrelevant. But what does become relevant under this definition is asset returns and the uncertainty about those asset returns. So those become critical. So that leads to the question, well, what would be more realistic assumptions about asset returns? I think you don't really need to get into the details of what these plans do. I think if you just group them into risky and safe assets, you kind of get at the essence of it for this kind of an analysis. And so, I'm kind of on board with a risk-free rate of 2.5%, an expected return on risky assets of say 7.5%. That's both nominal, but importantly, a standard deviation on those risky assets of 20%, which is kind of consistent with the stocks and the alternative assets that these pension funds invest in. Most of these, there's a variation in their investment strategies, but most of them are typically 60 to 80 or even 90% in risky assets. So for a given funding ratio, if you take this situation as being more true about asset returns, it kind of pushes in both directions. You have a higher expected return than most of the analysis in the paper, and that will make the funds appear to be more sustainable, and that it will take them longer to run out of money on average. But of course, that volatility implies there's a chance of running out of funds in the intermediate run. But certainly it's true that as soon as you take volatility into account, underfunding does increase the likelihood of exhausting your assets, and hence it does reduce sustainability, for better or worse. Okay. I think that by my definition of sustainability, which requires shortfalls to be much more unlikely, most public plans are in fact not sustainable. I recently published a paper with Dan Smith, who's now a PhD student at Boston College, which looked at actually the sustainability of a collective defined contribution plan, but it very much had the ingredients that would help you evaluate what was going to happen here. And the bottom line is that in a DB world, if you take our analysis as kind of representative of a typical public pension fund, in about 10% of years, even with very modest pension benefits promised, more modest than you see in the world, plans would run into problems. So I would encourage the authors to simulate the exhaustion date distributions for individual plans when returns are risky. I know they say in the paper that they're planning to do that in the future, but I think this current paper would be much more persuasive and informative if they would also look at it here. And I know I'm out of time, so thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. That was terrific. Josh Rao.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper, The Sustainability of State and Local Government Pensions, a Public Finance Approach. I also want to start out by commending the authors. I learned a lot from reading this paper, and I think that there's actually much that we can learn from it, although I do have some critiques of various pieces of it. So just as an overview, although I probably don't need to do this now being the second discussant, but obviously the paper is studying the sustainability of pension promises. The goal in the paper is the stabilization of pension debt to GDP or unfunded pension liabilities to GDP. This is a hard question because it requires the projections of annual pension fund cash flows and accruals in a landscape of heterogeneous plan design. So I fully appreciate how challenging this is. And furthermore, because of the long horizon nature of this exercise, it relies on a modeling of new entrants into the system under current pension deals that new entrants are receiving, which in many cases are different from earlier tiers due to reforms that have been implemented by public pension systems. And these reforms have varied across pension plans in the US. So it's really a pretty challenging exercise. The bottom line of the authors find, of course, is that only moderate fiscal adjustments are required to stabilize pension debt to GDP on average. There is significant heterogeneity. And so that's the finding, and I'm gonna have a few comments about that. So first of all, I think that the stabilization goal is very reasonable to consider. You know, I also want to agree with Debbie Lucas, the first discussant, and the authors, that it is perfectly reasonable to consider the goal of stabilizing unfunded liabilities to GDP, because the optimal level of public debt is very unlikely to be zero, and unfunded pension liabilities are another form of public debt. So in that sense, I very much appreciate the public finance approach that the authors are taking here with the stabilization goal. However, I think that there are some elements that are missing. And the main one is that the public sector's approach to funding pension liabilities with risk assets creates additional issues for this particular type of debt, for unfunded pension liabilities, relative to government bonds. And what is that issue that I have in mind? There is substantial instability due to market risk that isn't in the model, because the model is deterministic. There is no distribution of possible outcomes in this model. In fact, in practice, the higher expected return you target, the greater is going to be the distribution of outcomes, the wider is going to be the distribution of outcomes. But because of the non-stochastic nature of this exercise, that simply isn't in there. And so, you know, another way of saying this is a sentence that the first discussant, that Debbie Lucas said, which is that the likelihood of exhaustion is going to increase the more unfunded the liability is, and also the more risk that there is in the pension system. And in terms of that unfunded point, it comes to the idea that the stabilization that happens if one, you know, waits for a long time is going to be at a much lower level of funding. And so this is going to expose, in a stochastic analysis, would expose funds to much greater risk of insolvency. So in my view, actually, when I read this, I mean, in my view in this paper, the only meaningful scenario right now is the R equals D equals 0% real scenario. And in that scenario, the fiscal adjustment is, as Byron Lutz said, 14.9% of payroll if you start now, versus 29% if currently. Currently, that's the summary statistic for what is the contribution percent of payroll. So that's a 51% increase. And Byron, I heard you say that, you know, well, they've already increased by 10% of payroll in the past, so another 15% shouldn't really be a problem. Okay, I mean, it's a 51% increase. I think that's a statement that we can assess. I'm also going to provide some reasons that I think this still might be low. But, you know, even in the same breath as saying that criticism, I also want to say that I think we learn a lot, even from this R equals D equals 0% scenario, because underlying all of this is still the author's very careful analysis of what the reforms are that have already been made to pension benefits. And I think that's something that the literature or the research that I've seen has not really come to grips with. And I think that if the paper, the only main big contribution of the paper were to highlight that and say, what has that been worth in terms of reduced contribution increases, that by itself would be a very big contribution. So I want to say that. So some graphs that I just wanted to show to give a kind of big picture of this. This is from the Federal Reserve's Financial Accounts of the United States, and it shows the assets and liabilities of state and local pension plans. There is an original number, which I'm calling the old series, that was discontinued in 2018. And then there is a new series, which was begun in 2018, but it was also calculated going back. These are based on BEA, a BEA method from the BEA that is incorporated into the Federal Reserve's Financial Accounts of the United States. And so the point of this is to show that with the updated methodology, actually, you know, the official numbers for unfunded liabilities are, as of the latest 2020 Q4, around $4 trillion. So those are those numbers. There's some methodological details about, you know, how they do. Suffice to say, I think the new series is more accurate. Now, when you scale this by GDP, this is what the figure looks like. And the key thing I want to highlight is that since the financial crisis, unfunded liabilities to GDP have been hovering at around 20% of GDP. During this time, what has been going on? Okay, first of all, the S&P 500 total return, and pension funds are heavily loaded on the stock market, was 517% over this time period. So there were incredible tailwinds from equity markets over this time period. Other things that were happening where we had strong tailwinds or strong help were contributions to public pension plans by the governments rose from around 0.7% of GDP to over 1% of GDP. And the third thing that was going on is what the authors are highlighting, which is that there have been some benefit reforms that tend to affect the out years. And so I think that the big question is, have those benefit reforms been effective enough so that if we can kind of get over this, what the authors are modeling or are finding as a kind of hump in benefits to GDP, that that with some additional contribution increases that we can achieve sustainability without having to hope for these 15-16% annualized returns that we had over the recent period. All right, so standard finance market model. I just wanted to show a picture of this on the to illustrate, I think, what we've been trying to say about the importance of doing a stochastic modeling of these of the asset returns. This is just a standard finance market model, and again, as I was saying before, I appreciate, I'm on board with the wisdom of the public finance approach of saying, how can we stabilize unfunded pension liabilities with respect to GDP? But I'm not so on board with the idea of abandoning the finance insight, which is that if you target a higher expected return than the risk-free rate, you're taking on a distribution of outcomes. And this is a graph. You can play with the assumptions. There's a website here that I constructed with a colleague. And this is just a way to just visualize this over 30 years. What is the distribution of outcomes in the standard Black-Scholes-Merton assumptions? And you can tweak these in various ways. You can put in some shorter, medium-term mean reversion and so on. But this targets a 6% expected return. And that's roughly what the mean annualized expected return is over 30 years. But it shows that that's kind of in the 65th percentile of the distribution when you target that return. In fact, more than half the time, you don't achieve the expected return, and that's because the median of the distribution is below the average. I just think these are very important. As soon as one starts deviating from a risk-free scenario, I just think these are very important insights to build in. I also want to say that, I was excited when I saw that in this paper, the discount rate and the expected return might play distinct roles, because they should play distinct roles. The discount rate measures the liability. The expected return is measured by asset allocation. But in order to properly incorporate that expected return difference from the discount rate, one has to incorporate a distribution of outcomes. Also, I was asking myself, okay, what does it mean to separate the discount rate and the expected return in a deterministic analysis? And there is an analysis of this paper, of the LLSS paper by Kestrel and McGee, who analyzed the steady state of this paper. And they point out, and I believe this point that they make is correct, that the steady state contribution rate ultimately becomes independent of the discount rate and depends only on the expected return. And so the paper does rely on the idea that one can earn above risk-free profits with certainty in perpetuity. I just don't think that's a beneficial feature of the paper, given the potential that it has to make so many good points about what the impacts of the reforms that have been made have been on the necessary contributions. So again, in my view, the only meaningful scenario right now without a stochastic analysis, without a distribution of outcomes, is R equals D equals the risk-free rate. And as I mentioned before, the authors find that if you go from a 14.9%, if you go from a 29% of pay baseline, which is where we are right now, if you increase that to 14.9, you increase that by 14.9%, that would stabilize unfunded liabilities as a share of nominal GDP today. So that's a 51% increase. When I looked at just what the employer contributions would be that would be necessary, again, not to fully fund, but just to stabilize, to pay the present value of new benefit accruals, plus the interest on the unfunded liability, I found an 83% increase. And of course, the authors also find that if you wait 30 years, you only have to make a 30% increase. So I actually think the discussion should be around this. My number is probably too high because it doesn't incorporate the benefit changes that are going to happen in the out years that have already been built in for new employees. And so I think that there's definitely something to be learned here by understanding how much of a change in necessary contributions is occurring due to those changes. I do have some comments about the adjustments just even under this R equals D equals RF scenario, which is what I'm focusing on. First of all, there are a number of plans that are insolvent before 30 years. Around 35 to 40% of the plans are insolvent before 30 years. And there's this idea in the paper that plans can issue debt to smooth through the period of the peak benefit outflows. So, and Debbie Lucas made this point too, if there's any volatility, then there's a chance that more could become insolvent. And I think that that's a serious issue to contend with. I also maybe want to use that point to also point out the fact that there are a lot of plans in the U.S. states that have been issuing debt in order to fund pension obligations, either directly with pension obligation bonds, but maybe more commonly just by issuing lots of debt and making pension contributions. So I think that that's a piece of this that has to be considered as well. Second, this has been discussed before, weighting would stabilize the funding ratio to much lower level. It still becomes less costly as a share of payroll because of the G greater than R assumption in the model. But even taking that as a given, one has to consider the risk that the volatility is in the plan is going to add becoming insolvent. And then finally, I have a request to the authors, which is to really understand the mechanics. And when I say mechanics, I mean to understand how much these benefit changes have impacted the required contribution rates. There's some additional info that I think would be great to disclose, which are just, what are the model normal costs or service costs? These are the present value of new accruals at T equals 0 and T equals 30. What is it at the risk-free rate T equals 0 and T equals 30? What are the calculated pay-go rates at T equals 0 and T equals 30? And what is the funding ratio that we're stabilizing at if you start increasing contributions at T equals 0 versus T equals 30? That would help make the exercise a little more transparent. That's it. This is a really interesting paper. It's asking a very good question and taking on difficult modeling. I do appreciate the public finance goal of stabilization of pension debt to GDP and believe that's a valid goal to consider. But I think it's not advisable to ignore the finance insider distributions of outcomes. In talking about this paper, which I will a lot because I learned a lot from reading it, I'm going to emphasize the R equals D equals risk-free rate scenario until stochastic analysis is introduced. But I also just want to say that I think there's a lot of potential to learn something even just from the R equals D equals risk-free rate scenario, namely how much the new tiers have reduced necessary contribution increases. So I benefited a lot from reading this paper, and I think you should all read it as well.
Okay, thanks very much. So we're open for questions. You can raise your hand. You can chat, put something into the Q&A. You can put something into chat. There was a chat question that was raised, and I think I'm going to start with that. So Henry Aaron, hopefully you can unmute. And why don't you raise the question that you for the general discussion and audience.
The question is to Debbie Lucas. Her comments suggest that with volatility, there's a much greater chance of where assets are exhausted, and I think that's the condition of that makes the funds unsustainable. The question I had was whether taking that risk into account, there are interventions, if you will, quasi-insurance steps that funds could then apply to prevent that from occurring. And the question is, how serious or difficult would such insurance measures be? If steps can be taken in the event of unpleasant shocks to trust fund balances that are not excessively onerous, isn't the relative optimism of the paper's authors then restored?
So I guess there's several ways to talk about that, but What's salient to me is actually our analysis of a collective defined contribution plan. So the goal there was to ask the question, could you guarantee people a reasonable benefit using investments in a mix of risky and safe assets and have the contribution rates that you do today? And we found that the answer is unambiguously no. And what that means is that what that means is that if you invest enough in risky assets to create the kind of benefit levels that you want, with the contribution levels that we have, it just doesn't all add up because you're relying on that equity premium. And so there's this risk that you're going to run out. And so that's like an inescapable cost that you can't just sweep under the rug. So if you did buy insurance, you'd basically be having to pay that premium. Or another way to say that is if you didn't, the cost of the insurance is the difference between the risk-free liabilities and the risky assets. And that's why it makes sense to discount at different rates for the different things. But in any case, so that's one take. Just one more twist on that is to say more optimistically that actually the broader governments, not the pension fund. So I think the pension funds in themselves can't do it without investing considerably more, either in insurance premiums or in safer investment strategies. The state and local governments themselves could actually write insurance policies that would make sure that they didn't go into crisis. And I think they actually mostly do have the fiscal capacity to do that. But I think it's a question whether they have the political will to do that. So I'll leave it at that.
I'll add a question to the mix if there's time here. So both Debbie and Josh were recommending adding uncertainty to the analysis. And I wondered, maybe based on the analysis Debbie has done already, does that change your view of the heterogeneity? So you all sort of talked about how it would change a representative plan. Do those changes vary a lot by plan, or is it just sort of in general applying, standard errors around the estimates that we have already, or similar standard errors? And I can see where it would vary because different plans have different investment profiles. So some of them have riskier portfolios than others. So that would be one source of variation. Are there other significant sources of variation that would add to the heterogeneity that the authors identify already?
So Josh, I was going to let you take a stab at it because I spoke already, but
Okay. That was for me. All right. I'm sorry. I thought that was for the authors. Okay. Well, I guess what I would emphasize would be that I think the way to do this requires actually doing a stochastic simulation, basically a Monte Carlo simulation. And again, I think the reason for that, I think adding standard error bounds doesn't quite do it because of the asymmetry that you get when you model asset returns the way we typically do in finance. So to take the sort of Black-Scholes-Merton just log normal model that I showed, the median outcome is much below the expected return. So if you target an expected return of 2.5% real, that means that you're more than 50% likely to fall short of that. And I think until one does that kind of stochastic modeling, it's going to be hard to reflect that just by adding some error bounds.
Yeah, I guess my question was not so much, I probably shouldn't have mentioned standard error bounds because that threw the discussion in the wrong direction. My question was more about heterogeneity and whether adding the risk, would give us very different results for different plans over and above the fact that they have different investment profiles. And I think your comment about asymmetry tells me that the answer might be that it is quite different. But Louise, if you wanted to add.
Well, so I just want to sort of, first of all, thank you all for the comments. They were really fantastic. And I learned a lot just watching these slides and stuff. I think this whole question about sort of two things relate. We are definitely taking a public finance approach, not just about sustainability, but honestly thinking about this as basically government debt, right? So state and local governments have lots of future obligations. These are just obligations that they have. And so this idea that we could smooth through is really taking a very broad, just like some of us don't worry about the Social Security Trust Fund, we look at the unified budget. We're sort of looking at that, but we recognize that we really need a broader look at state and local government debt in general to do it this way. So we sort of said that. In terms of stochastic analysis, we do think it'd be very important and very interesting, but we also would not just want to do it on the returns, right? So the whole question is, what kind of world are we in when returns are higher than you think in terms of GDP? Because that's sort of what's going on. It's wages, demographics, GDP, all the things that affect returns also have direct effects on the pension. So it's a very complicated thing to do. We think it would be very useful. I also want to make a comment when we think about sustainability analysis, we are used to doing it for the federal government all the time. We are doing projected cash flows. A lot of those revenues are coming from capital income. We sort of just take expected values based on past experience. There's a lot of uncertainty there as well, but people seem to be kind of comfortable with that kind of sustainability analysis for the federal government. And when you're thinking about a state like California, you might think that's got a lot of similarity, that, it does have the ability to respond, as Henry asked, if something goes poorly. Let's see. The R minus G thing, are there no more questions? Can I just take the rest of the
Actually,
time?
let me just jump in. So we have at least one question from the audience. So let me get that and then give you a few seconds at the end. So Caroline.
Hi. Yeah, I hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
This is a question for the authors, and I guess for the discussants as well, but mainly for the authors. So there are a few papers recently that have demonstrated that many public sector employees would be willing to accept less than the present value of their pensions, their future pensions, if they were to get more of it in, current income. And there are political economy reasons why they tend to be paid in benefits and pensions and not be paid in salary and, present day income. Have you considered that at all? Because that's another method of stabilizing. I mean, some of the papers indicate that people would be willing to accept 50% of the value of their future pensions if they were to be given more of it in current income.
So obviously that's not what.
Wait, hold on 1 second. I'm going to give you one more question and then we're going to just turn it over. So David Wessel also asks, if the unfunded liability approach does not fully incorporate changes in pension benefits for new hires, does it provide a misleading metric for policymakers? So, okay, Louise, you've got like a minute. And then we wrap.
So we obviously haven't considered those papers, but I know them about people not being willing. So there's a big question on whether or not, when you ask people individually that they're not willing, or whether or not this idea that, state, local government jobs are good jobs and people don't really understand why they're good jobs. And, so there's a question of whether or not they should be providing these things. Anyhow, I agree with you. And that would be a way, just to lower their compensation. One of the things that I think we have thought about is how is it we can say that plans can just lower compensation in the future? How can you, don't we have a competitive labor market equilibrium? Doesn't that imply they're going to have to raise wages? And aren't we missing that part of the, you can't really do anything about the total compensation level? And I think maybe partially because of your reason, Carolyn, and also this idea that really interest rates have come down a lot. These defined benefit plans are worth a lot more. And because of constitutional constraints, they can't cut them ex post. So the people who got them, made a good bet, and they did well on their defined benefit, but that you can do it going forward. But I think that's a really good question, and thinking about sort of the paternalism or not. Remember that some of these people, about 25% of state and local employees, don't have Social Security. So you might find that same kind of thing, that people will be willing to get rid of Social Security benefits if you ask them, if I just gave you more money now. And so there's some question about sort of whether or not that's the right approach. On David's thing, I think that's right. I think one of the things that we do think is a value of this paper is recognizing that, just like in the Greenspan Commission, when they raised the retirement age 20 years in the future, you've seen that same kind of thing in the public pension space. And if you think about that and you're thinking about it from a long run public perspective, you want to smooth through that. That means you want to sort of let your assets dwindle a little bit now, because there's relief coming. Unlike the baby boom, which the benefits go up and they stay up, here they are really temporary and they do come down.
We could say the same thing about debt to GDP. So I guess I just would say that I don't think the unfunded liability ratio is any more or less misleading than just a debt to GDP
Totally,
ratio.
absolutely. It's
So
a current stock. It's
Yeah.
not the flows, which is another reason why, when CBO, Debbie showed us that nice chart, we like to do that for the federal government, is not just look at the current, but look at the trajectory. That's what we wanted to do for this, we'd like to do for the state and local sector as a whole. We started with the pensions.
Okay, thanks very much. We will reconvene, take a short break, and then reconvene at 11:05 Eastern.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.